As E3 gets closer and closer, I can only hope we're getting closer to news on Breath of the Wild 2 as well. In the meantime, we can enjoy speculating, theorizing, and just sharing our hopes and concerns for the game. Today, I want to share my thoughts on what I think would make it not only the ultimate sequel to Breath of the Wild, but the rest of the series before it. Basically, I created a hypothetical sequel that borrowed one aspect of each prior Zelda game. My picks aren't necessarily what I think the best feature of each game is, but specifically which one I think would fit best with what we know of the sequel so far. I had a lot of fun while doing this, and I hope you enjoy what I came up with. Without further ado, here's one thing from each Zelda game that I'd love to see in Breath of the Wild 2 to make it the best game possible. I think the best thing to borrow from the first Legend of Zelda is its basic formula. Breath of the Wild took half of this formula, the world exploration, and made it the best version yet, but the other half was practically ignored. Of course, I refer to the dungeons. The world of the first Zelda was a major part of the experience, but the dungeons were equally important and took up just as much playtime. I would love to see this balance between open world and labyrinthine dungeons return in the upcoming sequel. While Adventure of Link is still a black sheep of the series, it actually contributed quite a few lasting elements to the Zelda formula. The one that I'd like to see most in the upcoming game is magic spells. In Adventure of Link, you obtained a variety of spells for different purposes, and each one drained your magic meter. No games have featured magic to quite the same extent since, and I think that's honestly a shame. A Link to the Past's most iconic addition to the series is probably its feature of two interconnected worlds, and I'd like something in the same vein to return. Instead of the tried and true Light World and Dark World, or even time travel, I think the Breath of the Wild sequel's secondary world should be a vast underground. The trailer put this front and center, and I could make a whole video on my idea for how it can be expanded. But the short version is that Link or Zelda could activate things below ground that then rise up to the surface for the other character to complete. Expect a full video on this soon because I have a lot more ideas. What best sets Link's Awakening apart for me, besides its charming characters, is its thought-provoking story. I'm not saying the story of Breath of the Wild 2 should explore the same conflict, or even be structured the same way. But whatever it does, it would be fantastic for the game to have the same emotional impact as the ending of Link's first handheld outing. For Ocarina of Time, it was hard to think of just one thing. What makes the game so great, in my opinion, is how well it balances all the basic aspects of a Zelda experience. Its story, dungeons, and world are all very solid, so it was hard to find the one thing that I would carry over into the upcoming game. In the end, I settled on the concept of themed dungeons, because it was the first to really lean into this, in 3D at least. While there are plenty of other things I could have picked from Ocarina of Time, I would certainly love for dungeons to have distinct visuals and theming again. For Majora's Mask, the answer was much more obvious. The game emphasizes its side quests more than its main quests, and they go so far in fleshing out the setting and characters. Nearly all the quests are character-driven and really make you care about the people you meet, and oftentimes give you hidden information on them or the lore of Termina. On top of that, they have rewards that actually help you in a meaningful way, unlike Breath of the Wild's quests. I'd much rather get a new mask or permanent weapon than a chunk of ruby or sapphire. The Oracle games are a 2-in-1 combo, and I treated them as such for this list. While they each boast their own strengths, the best thing to come from the experience as a whole is the balance between action and puzzle solving. Seasons emphasizes the former, while Ages emphasizes the latter, but I think the ultimate Zelda game would prioritize them both. Breath of the Wild does have some pretty good puzzles scattered throughout, but definitely leans way more into the action than puzzle solving. So I really hope the sequel regains the balance the series is known for. The selling point of Four Swords is its multiplayer, and I really can't think of anything else that would remotely fit in the Breath of the Wild sequel. In the Game Boy Advance version, multiplayer was required, but I highly doubt that'll be the case again. Instead, it would be awesome if the sequel offered an optional multiplayer mode like Four Swords Anniversary Edition. In this case, it would most likely be some kind of co-op, with Link and Zelda being the playable characters, which I think would be great, if optional. Prior to Breath of the Wild, Wind Waker was the most open and free 3D Zelda game. What it did right was limiting the exploration to an extent, especially early on, both through story and item barriers. This may sound dreadful to fans who have only played Breath of the Wild, but I think it would actually make the sequel stronger. In addition to giving it more unique story moments, it would also bring back a satisfying sense of gradually unlocking new areas as you add more items to your toolkit. I could see this working really well in the theoretical underground sections, while the above ground is just as open as it was in the first game. For Four Swords Adventures, I really struggled to find an answer at all. The multiplayer was already my pick for the OG Four Swords, and none of the game's other unique aspects would really work for the upcoming sequel. In the end, I chose an oddly specific aspect of the story, a secondary villain. Not to spoil an obscure GameCube game, but it featured a sort of villain hierarchy with Vaati serving as Ganon's pawn and Shadow Link causing chaos somewhere in the mix. It would be really cool if the Breath of the Wild sequel featured a new sub-villain, but more fleshed out like Zant or Girahim. Astor from Age of Calamity, maybe? My pick for Minish Cap was also a bit niche. The Minish themselves would be the obvious choice, and were almost included in the first Breath of the Wild. However, with everything else already going on in my hypothetical game, adding another gimmick of switching between normal and tiny size might stretch the game too thin. Instead, I chose the Kinstone fusions, a feature unique to Minish Cap. This is another thing I could make a whole video on, because this system would need to be revised for the new game, but my basic idea is that you would fuse Kinstones with anyone at any time, and obtain corresponding rewards, like breakable items. The good stuff would be saved for the actual side quests. This is highly unlikely to happen, but I think it would be a pretty neat way to replenish your inventory in a pinch. Twilight Princess is another game where I'd like to see many aspects return, but the one I picked for this scenario is long, challenging dungeons. Previously on this list, I've mentioned the number and theming of dungeons, but I would model their structure after Twilight Princess's. Each one would take a substantial amount of time to complete and throw a few real head-scratchers in your path, while also containing rare collectibles and good weapons. They'd probably be a bit more open-ended to compensate for Breath of the Wild's engine, but you wouldn't be able to just brute force your way past them like your average shrine. Phantom Hourglass was another game where I had a hard time pulling something, but in the end I went with iconic side character. Lionbeck is one of the best things to come out of Phantom Hourglass, and is one of the most memorable Zelda characters. He has personality and grows as a person throughout the game, which is something the series needs more of. The new game's side character wouldn't have to follow you around the whole time or anything, and doesn't need to have the same personality as Lionbeck, but I'd love for there to be another character who leaves this kind of impression. I think the champions and Cass already do this in Breath of the Wild, but this was literally the only thing I could think of for Phantom Hourglass, so in conclusion, just bring Cass back and give him an even bigger role, Nintendo. While I feel like one of 10 people in the whole fandom that genuinely loves Spirit Tracks, I think anyone can agree that the relationship between Link and Zelda was very endearing in that game. Skyward Sword is more known for that now, but Spirit Tracks was actually the first one to really delve into a deeper friendship between them, and possibly even a romance at the end. Therefore, this is the aspect I chose to include from Spirit Tracks in my hypothetical sequel, and based on the trailer it seems like this might actually happen. Speaking of Skyward Sword, what I chose to incorporate from that game is its well-developed story. It shouldn't be as linear and stifling in the sequel, as that would turn many new fans away, but having an open world doesn't mean there can't be an actual story that develops as you progress. I know I'm beating a dead horse at this point, but please Nintendo, don't repeat the memory structure. Please give us clearly established motivation, developing characters, and plot twists again. A Link Between Worlds was another challenge for this video. I love the game, and it does a lot right, but so much of it has been mentioned on this list already. The only obvious thing left was the item rental system, but as much as that worked in its original context, I wouldn't want it ported into Breath of the Wild 2. In the end, I settled on item variety. This could apply to almost every game on the list so far, but since I haven't mentioned it yet, it might as well go to A Link Between Worlds. The 3DS game includes many items that grant unique abilities, which leads to diverse puzzles and combat scenarios. Breath of the Wild had relatively few items, so the sequel can fix that. Triforce Heroes was surprisingly easy, and Breath of the Wild basically uses my pick from it already. As bizarre as the latest multiplayer Zelda is, one thing it did that I really like was include a variety of outfits that each enhanced different abilities. These outfits could even be upgraded to make their abilities stronger. Like I said, Breath of the Wild basically did this exact same thing, so there's no reason the sequel can't do it even better. I'd like to see the game go all out with the concept and find even more skills to tie into the clothing sets. Last but not least is Breath of the Wild itself. With so many other things already chosen, I had to pick an obvious one and go with the game's engine. This is basically guaranteed to happen, but even if it wasn't, Breath of the Wild's physics were one of the best parts of the game. Even barring all the fun glitches and exploits that have been found, Breath of the Wild's movement and the way you can interact with almost everything made the world feel much more alive. I'm confident we'll see this again in the new game, and I'm looking forward to that. It's obviously unrealistic to expect all of these things from the sequel, but if Breath of the Wild 2 incorporated even half of this list, it would be a vast improvement over the first game in my opinion, easily in my top 5. I love the amazing things that Breath of the Wild accomplished, but it's always bothered me that so much from the previous games was sacrificed in the process. By looking back to those earlier games, the sequel can incorporate the best of both worlds and make a true masterpiece. But I want to hear your thoughts. What would you include from each previous game? Let me know in the comments. This is FP Productions, and I'll see you next time.